As I was saying, let me just give a few examples of our collective successes, things as one, which are by no means comprehensive. The Global Refugee Forum took place in December 2019, where most of us participated. The participation of the Multilateral Development Bank's platform on economic migration and forced displacement in the forum was particularly noteworthy, reaffirming the support to the forced displacement agenda across all MDBs. Through the platform secretariat, we have also been engaging with the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement office. I'm happy to see George as a panelist this afternoon. The virtual launching of the IOM Continental Strategy for Africa 2020-2024 in November 2020, together with the African Union, regional economic communities and partners, including African Development Bank, was another signal on our desire to urgently work together in addressing the challenges of irregular migration and forced displacement. I could list many more examples, but in the interest of time, these are just examples that showcase that these important strategic partnerships are existing and strong. They are also concrete. For example, the African Development Bank, UNHCR joint COVID-19 response project in the Sahel, targeting internally displaced persons, refugees, and host communities and border communities in the G5 Sahel countries. Our work with IOM in Somalia and Burundi are other examples. This is all good, but with over 250 million Africans affected by fragility, we know much more needs to be done. Over 29 million Africans are forcibly displaced, and the trend over the past few years is not going in the right direction. No African, nobody should be forcibly displaced. The total international migrant stock of the African continent in 2019 was around 30 million people, and contrary to some narratives, migration is largely intra-African. Our panel today will certainly share their perspectives on some of the latest data and developments. The COVID-19 pandemic has further aggravated existing vulnerabilities and disproportionately impacted forcibly displaced persons, especially those living in conflict-affected and fragile settings. The pandemic and necessary protection measures have also severely restricted human mobility. Despite ongoing efforts to operationalize the humanitarian-development-peace Nexus approach to address the root causes and find durable solutions to forced displacement in Africa, we still see too often institutional silos, absence of integrated, multisectoral, and inclusive responses, fragmented funding, and exclusion of displacement-affected communities from peace processes and national planning. It is also often overlooked that forcibly displaced persons are active agents of peace and development. The African Union theme for 2020, Silencing the Guns, Creating Conducive Conditions for Africa's Development, highlighted the need to focus on conflict prevention and create synergies between political, peace, and development actors to find durable solutions to forced displacement in Africa and prevent a relapse into violent conflict. In this regard, this session will examine how the inclusion of forced displacement issues in African peace agreements can provide a paramount opportunity to ensure the safe and voluntary repatriation and integration of forcibly displaced populations, while also harnessing the important role they play in post-conflict reconstruction and development efforts. It will also consider how COVID-19 recovery efforts can contribute towards building resilience, strengthening prevention, and promoting inclusivity of forcibly displaced populations in line with the SDG pledge on leaving no one behind. Distinguished panelists, dear participants, with these opening remarks, let me now turn on to the panel. High Commissioner Grandi, you have 5 minutes. How do you see the operationalization of the humanitarian development peace nexus on the ground? especially in line of the COVID-19 pandemic, and has UNHCR recalibrated its operations accordingly. What good practices exist where humanitarian peace and development actors strengthen synergies and coherence to promote more effective operationalization of the Nexus approach. Over to you, High Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Balde. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. And I also would like to take advantage of this question you're asking to really thank Egypt for this very welcome initiative of convening again the Aswan Forum, although in a different format for given the situation, and for the role that Egypt has played throughout its own chairmanship of the African Union and beyond, of course, in advocating around the issues that are part of my world, issues of forced displacement, of refugees, of internal displacement, and so forth. So thank you very much. So I open with an expression of gratitude. And let me go to that world of mine that I have just mentioned. This is a world, just to put things in context, and as many of you know, made of 80 million people, refugees, internally displaced people, asylum seekers, and other people forced to move, obviously, in the context of an even bigger phenomenon of human mobility. I'm sure that the DG of IOM or Jeff will talk about that. We live in a world of much increased mobility that makes this one of the greatest challenges of our time. And you, Mr. Balde, you asked me about synergies, development, humanitarian. This is a world in which we have to face so many crises, but the synergies are few. And look at the continents, look at Libya. So much focus on one aspect of the crisis on the part of the Europeans, for example, the boats, the arrivals in Europe. And really, frankly, let me be frank, as I'm usually very little attention for the root causes. Why are these people moving? Why are they ending up in Libya? Look at the Sahel, a region that I frequently visited in the last couple of years. A lot of attention on the security aspect, and legitimately so, but much less on the development, on the education gap, other very important underlying issues. So synergies are not the forte of our international community in responding to this complex crisis. And yet, without synergies, you cannot respond to complexity. Now, the COVID response is a very good test for that, because of course the temptation of the international community will be, has been, is to focus on the health aspect. And again, very legitimately so, because we need to make sure that we have proper medical care for those that are sick, proper prevention for those that are not, and proper vaccines and vaccinations for all. But of course, if you look at it from my perspective, the perspective of forced displacement, the perspective of a very vulnerable population, even more vulnerable in a context of COVID, you need to be much broader in the response. You need to ensure that people on the move, forced to be on the move, are included in the health responses, but also in the economic rescue packages that are being put in place to address the impact of lockdowns in most countries. That's why we are talking to the IFIs in this respect. You need to make sure that all the children that have dropped out of school because schools have been closed can go back to school, not just nationals, but refugees, displaced people as well. And we have worrying signals that this is not happening for them. Even when schools reopen, refugee children, for example, are the last ones to be able, because this is linked to the poverty crisis that COVID has provoked. And I could give many other examples. Now, I want to also take this opportunity in the few minutes I have to really thank again African countries. African countries have been very inclusive, although very few African countries have had the possibility yet to start vaccination programs, for example. Most African countries have already said that they will include refugees, displaced, and other people on the move in their vaccinations. But I want to take this opportunity to thank African countries for their very far-reaching, inclusive policies for refugees in general. Look at Uganda, look at Kenya, Niger, Djibouti, look at Egypt itself. I remember a very inspiring conversation with a minister of education in Egypt saying, you know, how can we leave behind the many, many refugees that live in Egypt? They should be included in national education program. This concept of inclusion is really the key message I want to leave with you, Mr. Balde, and with the panel and with the audience, because that's the foundation, you mentioned it yourself, of the Global Compact on Refugees that really has become somehow the roadmap for all of us, member states, UN, civil society, going forward in responding to crisis of forced displacement. I want to single out also the World Bank in particular as a very valuable partner. The World Bank was quick off the mark around the Global Compact, established under the IDA program, the program for countries with less resources, a refugee window, as they called it, valued at $2 billion under IDA 18, valued at $2.2 billion under the current IDA 19. It's now called Host Community and Refugee Window. And the World Bank was quick off the mark in deciding that although the window is a hybrid of loans and grants, the grant component will be very much prevailing in this current circumstances of COVID response, when countries can ill afford to increase their debt for these purposes. We are presently working with 12 countries in Africa with the IDA refugee window, about 30 projects. These are bilateral arrangements between these countries and the World Bank. UNHCR participates in the programming, but it's really a bilateral arrangement. Why do I mention this? I mention this to answer your question, that we are now moving very concretely in realizing this nexus, this synergy. I cannot make sure that all the synergies that are necessary, in particular on the political and security front, are triggered when we respond to this crisis. But certainly on the humanitarian development nexus, we have made great strides. And you mentioned yourself, and of course you represent that institution, the African Development Bank stepped up to the plate in the Sahel with a very important joint program to respond to the COVID pandemic. We are working with the G5 Sahel, also an institutions devoted to development, and I can give you many examples. I hope that these pioneering projects, World Bank, African Development Bank, G5 Sahel, can be followed by others. We should stop saying that the nexus needs to be implemented. The nexus is already happening. We just need to become even more substantive, creative, and systematic in applying it in responding to this situation. Thank you very much, Mr. Bang.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner, for those good insights on synergies, inclusion, and to put inclusion at the center of the COVID response, providing the right financing mechanism for host communities and refugees, and of course, it's all about scaling up. So let me now move on to a short video by the Director General of IOM, Antonio Vitorino, and the video will be played.
Excellencies, distinguished panel members, colleagues, it is my privilege to deliver remarks for this second ASEAN Forum for Sustainable Peace and Development in Africa. Now, more than ever, our actions must galvanize every opportunity to shift from crisis management to prevention. while enabling the millions who remain displaced to recover stronger and rebuild better post-COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated conditions for already vulnerable populations. At the same time, displacement has and will continue to increase due to impacts of natural disasters, conflicts, and of climate change. Challenges to peace, to security, and development persist. Africa is among the regions most affected by internal displacement. But it also boasts the world's only legally binding regional instruments to protect and assist internally displaced people. The contribution of the Kampala Convention cannot be underestimated for localizing the paradigm shift from crisis management to prevention and fostering durable solutions in Africa. Moving from crisis management to prevention requires addressing root causes at the individual, community, and institutional levels. The African Development Agenda 2063, in complementarity with the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, will certainly pave the way to reaching this common goal. All of government approaches should promote inclusive governance, strengthen healthcare systems, social contracts, accelerated sustainable development, and investing in climate change adaptation. Populations in displacement-affected areas are the most valuable and important resource in building self-reliance, reducing aid dependency, and driving durable solutions. Being inclusive is more than consulting with communities. It requires strengthening the processes needed to empower populations to take their own steps towards recovery and towards resilience. Responding to the pandemic has further reinforced the importance of the humanitarian development and peace nexus, and widened our outlook regarding the complex interlinkages to displacement, including health, mobility, and climate. The world's fastest growing cities are all in Africa, with urban population expected to triple by 2050. In this way, solutions to internal displacement are closely linked to rural-urban movements and urbanization. The pandemic posed the real challenges to the realization of the free movement of persons protocols at continental level, despite major advances at regional level. The achievements of the free movement of goods and persons and economic integration, notably with the entry into force of the AFCFTA on 1st January 2021, as open cross-border movement are key drivers of development. Once movements can be normalized again, and it will, the development potential of mobility on African economies will be integral to recovering from the pandemic. At IOM, we also see mobility as a key to progressively resolving displacement situations. It is an opportunity for displaced persons to build self-reliance and pursue their own solution. It is also time for states to ensure that these vulnerable populations are included in development planning, and no one is left behind. Excellencies, to conclude, IOM is committed to supporting states as they lead the prevention and resolution of displacement. There is no time to lose. The pandemic has highlighted that building resilience through prevention and inclusive sustainable development is necessary to withstand and mitigate unforeseen crises, shocks, or future pandemics to ensure that truly, no one is left behind.
Thank you very much, Director General, especially for reminding us of the Kampala Convention, issue of inclusive governance, and also, of course, the development potentials of, mobility. So, Director Jeffrey, building on to the Director General's message, briefly in 5 minutes or less, you can. From IOM's experience in managing peace-building projects, while also engaging on the ground in humanitarian responses, how does IOM navigate the humanitarian peace nexus on the ground? Having embarked on a number of initiatives to operationalize the nexus, how does IOM measure the success of these interventions and their impact on climate and conflict and violence-induced displacement in Africa? And also, if you can tell us what you think are the setbacks for a nexus approach. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and excellencies and distinguished participants. It's a pleasure to be here. Indeed, we have long worked to accompany national authorities and local partners across the humanitarian development and peace nexus. The HDPN highlights the importance of bringing together humanitarian action to strengthen national ownership with accountability to displaced populations, their host communities, and local government. IOM has been building upon this approach for over 2 decades with a dedicated transition and recovery division. Today, I would like to share with you one of our flagship projects, which took place in Somalia. Let's go back a couple years. And I think you referred to it, Mr. Chair, because it also benefited from ADB funding. In 2017, a worsening drought was driving up the number of IDPs in a town called Kismayo, which was also receiving a disproportionately high number of returning refugees. As a result, there was a rapid surge in humanitarian response, combined with large assistance packages to returnees in a town already facing a high level of poverty. In a do no harm framework, this assistance raised the risk that support for returnees would lead to conflict with local populations. Solutions were needed both for returnees and IDPs and the community at hand. Through consultations with the government, IDPs themselves, and communities, it became clear that the key part of the solution was to establish foundations for peace. In addition to the significant infrastructure and economic needs, we saw a critical need for 2 more things: the need for civic dialogue to address grievances and strengthen cohesion, and the need to restore trust in the newly formed local administration. IOM used what is called a community stabilization methodology, which included inclusive participatory planning. Supporting government to lead would restore trust and counter other destabilizing influences, including recruitment by extremist groups. IOM joined forces with other United Nations and NGO partners to support the government to address urban planning, employment creation, and governance through a whole of UN approach. 3 years on, the project has had a huge impact on making progress towards durable solutions through improved access to education, public infrastructure, and the establishment of integrated settlements. The leadership of local authorities was crucial for ensuring restored trust and confidence, as well as reducing the space for non-state armed actors to operate, empowering communities and IDPs to define and drive their own solutions contributes to upholding the principle of humanity and dignity by empowering affected populations as individuals with capacity and agency to define their own priorities. What I think is most important, however, is that establishing capacities for peaceful coexistence was at the core of the program, which was entitled MID-NIMO, which means unity. We continue to adapt this approach across Africa, whether it's Mozambique or Sudan or Burkina Faso, the broader Sahel, and even around the world. We have shared our experience with the high-level panel on IDPs as they consolidate to identify best practices, and you'll hear from George soon. Only working together can we achieve sustainable, durable solutions, and we need to make the local authorities and national authorities accountable and support their efforts to bring us together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director Jeffrey, for really, using the Somalia case study to again tell us about the IOM community stabilization methodology, which really focuses on establishing foundation for peace, with a particular emphasis on getting durable solutions for building capacity for peaceful coexistence. Thank you very much. And now I'll move over to Honorable Peter Manjotti. Honorable Minister, the inclusion of forcibly displaced persons in the formulation and implementation of the revitalized agreement on the resolution of conflict in South Sudan is key to finding durable solutions for the mounting displacement crisis and to harness their potential contributions to recover stronger and rebuild better. In light of this, to what extent would you say are the long-term developmental and security needs of forcibly displaced populations, including returnees, addressed in post-conflict reconstruction and development efforts in South Sudan? How do you evaluate the current progress towards implementation? And in what ways have South Sudanese forcibly displaced populations been leveraged in the formulation and implementation of peace processes? 5 minutes, Honorable Minister.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you for the panel. I hope everybody hears me very loud and clear. First and foremost, I would really thank the Aswan forums and the government of Egypt for initiating this very important forum where we could be able collectively to be able to discuss and find durable solutions towards refugees, returnees, and to be able to find solutions that not only will help the African continent, but also will address a number of challenges on a global basis. Actually, the revitalized government of national unity that is formed based on the agreement, it has actually made it a process that the inclusions of the refugees and the returnees on the implementation of the peace process and the peace process remains a very important issue. So they are included for a simple and easy reasons that once you are not part and parcel of any process, therefore your rights, your issues probably will not be addressed. So the agreements guarantee the right of the internal displaced persons. They also guarantee the right of the refugees based on the Article 3. And basically the Article 3 actually address a number of the humanitarian challenges. The implementations perhaps may have its own challenges due to the COVID-19 that it happens, and also due to the political system in the country. However, South Sudan today is one of the host countries that hosting a number of refugees as well. Also, we have a number of South Sudanese that are displaced and around the regions and far as to Egypt. And as such, it's very important that as the parties to this agreement try to find a political solution, and I agree with some of the speakers earlier that, of course, one of the durable solutions to this process is to find a political solution, find an economical solutions, so that those who are displaced in any way, neither by war, whether they're because of the economic reasons or because of any other, including natural disasters, could be able to return home. And I want to tell the entire panels that home is home. It's extremely important that the refugees and the internal displaced persons could be able to find a decent life so that they could be able to have. However, we have challenges. Some of those challenges which include, but not limited to, the fact that as refugees, internal displaced persons come back home, they need a roof on their heads, they need a house, they need shelter, they need medicines. And also with COVID-19, we're also going to find a lot of difficulties in this. In regards to the status of South Sudan, is basically to impose peace at all costs and making sure that the parties and the leaders to these agreements abide toward this peaceful process, and we limit, of course, African resolutions. Silencing gun is very important. It's something that we need to protect us all as Africans. And also we have to understand that the refugee crisis is not just only an issue of one country, but it's actually a regional issue, because basically when conflict arises in any of the regions, if it arises in Ethiopia, it affects Sudan, it affects South Sudan, and that's why South Sudan and South Sudan both hold refugees on those way. However, the far more important is that, of course, we could not just move on the issue of addressing refugees issues, internal displaced persons, but we have to move from humanitarian aspect towards resilience and towards development, which actually is a very important thing. And that's what actually my region needs, and that's what the African region needs. Why do we have so many refugees that crossing over to Europe and all this? So basically, the idea of addressing the root causes is really very, very much important. And when we talked about the root causes, that's whereby poverty comes in, economic challenges, inability of governments to deliver services to their own citizens, and also the fact that the country, the security around the regions, we talked a little, I had some speakers talked a little bit earlier about the Somalia case, and also South Sudan could be also a case that also could be reflected on this. So it's really, we have to find a durable solution as we address the challenges. Of course, we will not wait to find a durable solutions and wait for refugees and internal displaced persons to suffer in between, and even the movements of people here, so we have to find a durable solution on the basis that we have a goal, and the goal is to achieve 2020 Africa of silent guns, and also to achieve economic development so that people at home could be able to have jobs, could be able to have food on the tables. That will limit the movement. But it still will also agree to the fact that those who are already in the crisis need to be delivered. So right now, South Sudan has a government in place, and the government has included the refugees in participation towards these agreements, so that the refugees can be able to have the right and have their say as the citizen of South Sudan. And that means also they need to come back home. But if they come back home, there is a need for them to have a roof over their head, they need water, they need shelter. But the durable solution in South Sudan has to be peaceful, and the region has to be peaceful, and we have to address the root causes, but we will not forget the economic crisis that the country suffers, and also the deficit of the development. Thank you. Back to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for really giving us a practical example of, where the refugees actually being involved in the peace building processes that are going on in South Sudan, where you're really trying to address the root causes and then bringing development at the forefront, so that there will be durable solutions to help in realizing the silence in the objectives of the silence in the Guns initiative of the African Union. And of course, you brought in the issue of the regional dimension for really tackling refugee situations. Thank you very much for those insights. Now, I'll move on to Honorable Nevin El-Husseini. Honorable Nevin, Egypt hosts more than 5 million persons in refugee-like situations, escaping protracted armed conflict, violence, and climate shocks. The challenges posed by the pandemic further underscored the importance of international cooperation to support forcibly displaced populations and host states, which resonates with the principle of burden and responsibility sharing. The Egyptian government, in cooperation with UNHCR and its international and national partners, has launched Egypt Response Plan for refugees and asylum seekers from sub-Saharan Africa, Iraq, and Yemen, 2020 to 2021, which aims to protecting and addressing the needs of the most vulnerable among refugees and the host communities. How would you assess the implementation of this response plan? And to what extent would you say that the principle of burden and responsibility sharing has been put to practice across the continent? Over to you, Honorable Minister.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. Good afternoon, Excellencies, dear panelists, distinguished participants. First of all, I'm really honored and delighted to be joining this distinguished group of speakers. And I would like to thank the Cairo Regional Center for organizing this important event that addresses forced displacement in our continent, which faces a chronic challenge of displacement for decades. Well, before I answer this question, please allow me to share a glimpse about protection that Egypt provides for asylum seekers. Egypt is home to around 260,000 asylum seekers and refugees registered with the UNHCR. Almost half of them are from Syria, while the other half come from sub-Saharan Africa, Iraq, and Yemen. During the past 5 years, the number of registered refugees has doubled. The majority of them come from Africa. In addition to registered refugees, Egypt hosts around 5 to 6 million persons who fled conflicts in their countries, but did not feel the need to ask for refugee status. However, given the situations in which they fled their countries, they are considered in refugee-like situation. They mainly come from Sudan, South Sudan, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and Iraq. Located at the heart of the Arab world and at the gateway of Eastern Africa, the correlation between instability in the neighboring countries and the flows of asylum seekers and migrants in a refugee-like situation cannot be more obvious. The prospects of safe return from them remain very grim as the political crises are protracted. It is also believed that the number of asylum seekers and refugees from these countries will further increase in the upcoming years. The government is committed to include refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in the provision of all essential services on equal footage with Egyptian citizens. I believe that we cannot agree, that we all agree that the COVID pandemic clearly revealed the fact that no one can be safe until everyone is safe. Therefore, supporting host countries and communities in accordance with the strategic objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees and the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework to prevent further outbreak of infection and enhance protection of displaced is more critical now than ever. Well, let me come to the question you have posed, sir. As a host country and in cooperation with the UNHCR, Syrian refugees are supported through the Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan, 3RP. Since the launching of this fundraising mechanism more than 5 years ago, Syrian refugees in Egypt only received 1% of the funds, which is disproportionate to the number of Syrian refugees it hosts. As for asylum seekers and refugees from sub-Saharan Africa, the UNHCR initiated with its UN partners and NGOs a complementary country appeal known as the Egypt Response Plan that aims to address the needs of 129,000 refugees and asylum seekers from 57 countries of origin. In 2020, humanitarian agencies identified a total need of $89.6 million to provide services to the refugees and asylum seekers from sub-Saharan Africa, Iraq, and Yemen living in Egypt. Priority areas of intervention included food security, education, health, improving registration, cash assistance, and promoting livelihood opportunities. This plan only received 48% of the appeal funding, which is not enough to cover all the needs. But it is a slight improvement over the 42.6% received in 2019. Food security received all funds requested, but ironically, health received only 10% of the funds required despite the COVID crisis. It is worth noting that donors only fund UN agencies and international organizations, not the government, which actually provide basic services, including education in Arabic public schools, primary health services, and subsidized public services. The example I shared raises many questions pertaining to the level of commitments by international community and invites us to think if there is a real burden sharing with host countries and communities or actually burden shifting. Bearing in mind that developing countries host around 85% of refugees. We need to tackle issues such as how far do political interests, foreign policy concerns, public opinion, and other factors that has nothing to do with the protection of displaced affect the decisions and policies of international cooperation. Sustainability of assistance and coherence with development plans and the provision of basic needs in a way that fosters social cohesion and mainstream refugees in social planning is another important issue. Lastly, but not least, as voluntary return is very limited, encouraging resettlement in third countries is of paramount importance to mitigate the negative effects of protracted displacement on host countries. In a country like Egypt, for example, less than 10% of the number of new flows of registered refugees is being resettled every year. Of course, this percentage dropped badly last year due to the corona travel restrictions. In conclusion, I believe that the outbreak of the pandemic would lead to better acknowledgement of the burden host countries carry and the need to introduce more efficient and innovative mechanisms to share this responsibility and support the resilience of host communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Honorable, for really giving us an overview of the situation in Egypt in terms of the hosting of asylum seekers, but also refugees other individuals that are in refugee-like situations, going to about 5 to 6 million. And of course, the financial pressure that goes with that. Then you also very, explicitly, alluded to the issue of burden sharing and the need to really look into this in a much more efficient and innovative manner. And also not to lose the focus on the refugees themselves when we are involved in this policy dialogue, looking at this thing. So thank you so much for these comments. Now I'll move on to Director Stan Quinn. On the prevention front, UNDP aims to support states in designing integrated and inclusive programs that strengthen resilience in communities at risk of displacement. The newly established UNDP Africa Borderland Center in Kenya, which supports African states and the African Union to address the needs of borderland communities in the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, and the Lake Chad Basin, is a case in point. Mindful of crisis triggers such as the COVID-19 pandemic and the surge in conflict and violence, how can African states, together with local actors and humanitarian development peace practitioners, transform long-standing fragility in remote communities to opportunities for inclusive development and sustaining peace? And how can they ensure the resulting gains are preserved? 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you very much, moderator, and thanks to the organizers for inviting UNDP. The focus on borderland areas is a welcome one. The very nature and the immediate impacts of forced displacement require us to pay special attention to borderland regions, both as areas where harsh economic realities can breed extreme poverty, deprivation, and conflict, and as the first and closest destinations for people fleeing violence and persecution from neighboring countries. The socio-economic realities of borderland dwellers also serve as accelerators for forced displacement, including development-related migration. And it's important that national plans focus on these areas as well. UNDP established in 2020 its Africa Borderland Center, as you stated, which will drive the design and implementation of tailored borderlands programs that integrate development, prevention, and peace-building approaches to address both the root causes and negative impacts of forced displacement. This is consistent with the new way of working as endorsed by the World Humanitarian Summit. Ongoing work supported by UNDP demonstrates how integrated approaches can support sustainable development in borderland regions and ensure the inclusion of forced displacement as a concern and as a focus in national plans. Through UNDP's Regional Stabilization Facility for the Lake Chad region and its support to the Lake Chad Basin Commission, we have developed cross-border interventions in the reconstruction of trade routes and community infrastructure, such as schools and markets. These are practical contributions to the scaling up the capacity of host communities and in supporting the return of the millions of displaced persons in the Lake Chad Basin. Preparations for cross-border short-term stabilizations interventions in the Diptako-Goma region in the Sahel are also underway. These efforts will complement national and international security operations in support of community security as a first step to the return of state and local government to the borderland areas. The uniqueness of this stabilization approach in these borderlands is that they address the perceptions of marginalization of the populations in order to regain their confidence, prevent armed groups from returning, and lay a firm foundation for the return of the almost 1.5 million individuals that are displaced as a result of the security crisis. In the Horn of Africa, UNDP has supported the building up of local level peace and security structures to strengthen local social cohesion. It's been supporting the socioeconomic transformation of these areas through cross-border trade and supporting governments in developing sound policies on regional cooperation and management of transboundary resources. To ensure durable solutions to forced displacement, peace, development, and stability, UNDP focuses on 4 key areas. First, strengthening the joint evidence base that is shared, developing local solutions to complex challenges, mainstreaming conflict prevention and disaster risk reduction in national planning, and building partnerships on strengthening humanitarian development coordination. Moving forward, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to have a greater socio-economic effect on countries impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence, and in borderland communities. We must therefore work to first build trust between the state and the citizens, include displaced persons, women and youth in development planning efforts, and explore opportunities for strengthening local trade and intra-African trade through the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And finally, promote and strengthen sub-regional and multi-country cross-border approaches. The Africa Borderlands Center has identified measures to address the most critical structural causes of forced displacement. We count on the support of our partners to ensure that the center will successfully utilize research, analysis, and innovative approaches to curate, test, and pilot creative ideas capable of unleashing economic potential and strengthening social cohesion in the borderland areas. To conclude, through the ongoing efforts, lessons learned, and increased focus on borderlands, African states, together with local actors and humanitarian development peace practitioners, who will help to transform long-standing fragility in displaced communities into opportunities for inclusive development and sustaining peace. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Stan. Again, for once again reminding us on the need to really, focus on borderland, communities, because they could potentially be, accelerators for forced displacement if, neglected. So their inclusion in the national plans is very, very important. And of course, for the stabilization facility and the wonderful work it is doing in the Lake Chad Basin, and African Development Bank is happy to be associated with some of the work that is going on there, and we are hoping to do more, especially again in scaling up intervention for host communities. And of course, the local level peace and security structures that are in place in the Horn of Africa to facilitate cross-border trade. And you also emphasize again the issue of the sub-regional and multi-country approach in dealing with borderland issues. And we hope the Africa Borderland Center will serve as a center of excellence in terms of increasing the knowledge in this area. Thank you so much. So now I would like to move on to Excellency George Okotobo, mindful of their intersecting needs as internally displaced persons and refugees are not merely 2 points on the trajectory of forced displacement. In fact, evidence suggests that most IDPs seem to be drawn principally from hot zones where violence is concentrated and are often fragile and marginalized. The establishment of the high-level panel on internal displaced by the UN Secretary General is testament to the gravity of the crisis. In light of your upcoming report to the UN Secretary General, how can African states and other external partners better address structural factors to prevent and achieve solutions to the internal displacement crisis? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yero. I hope you can hear me. Nice to see you again since we saw each other 14 months ago at this very forum. In that occasion, yes. Was in person. Yero, I have been trying all my life since 65 years to be excellent, and I'm not even good. So please call me George. That will perfect.
Okay. All right. No problem. I hear that.
Delighted to see so many friends.
Maybe something is on the way.
Absolutely. It's really a strange thing what COVID has done. My former boss, the High Commissioner for Refugees, who is here with us, is in terms of geography less than 5 kilometers from where I am, but we haven't seen each other in nearly a year. We look forward very much to how things will change. But let me also join him in thanking very much Egypt for providing this platform for all of us, not only to see each other, but to share, and of course, for the panel to try and speak through me on where it is on its work at large, but particularly the question in relation to solutions. Yero, the panel has been working now for the last 12 months. It is at the point where it is starting to draw out its conclusions and recommendations. So you will understand how, as a servant of the panel, I can just describe the broad contours of the work, especially that which it has placed into the stakeholder domain. Everything that I am going to say now has been externalized and is subject of the consultations that the panel is having now in ground testing these conclusions that are starting to emerge, including with the Africa group, with which it met as a whole group just 2 weeks ago. And we have had and are continuing to have a lot of substantive contact with this region in terms of the conclusions to evolve. Let me say first of all that what the panel has indicated and it's shaping its conclusions around by way of its key themes include the question of visibility, the question of prevention, solution, which is probably the thick middle of the work of the panel, improving the response to address some of the issues that you said yourself, the Director General of IOM, the High Commissioner, all have spoken to this. The panel is tackling that issue as well. And then finally, which has also been mentioned, an international system and national community that is fit for purpose. These are the 5 or 6 key themes that the panel is now shaping its work on. But there is no question whatsoever that of all these, the bridgehead of what the panel proposes to bring to the world is centered around solutions. And in the particular context of Africa, the points that I would like to share here are 4. The first one is that probably the most important grounding for solutions at large, but particularly in the African context, will be the issue of political ownership and political will. And the work of the panel over the last 12 months in relation to the Africa region has revealed 2 typologies, both of which will influence the report. let me begin with the one which is half full, or more than actually half full. And that this is a region which has taken, certainly at regional level, crucial steps in owning the internal displacement question as a national question and as a question of political governance and accountability, which the panel is convinced is really the only way that solutions can be brought. Humanitarian response may be delivered without coming in that framework, but absolutely not solutions. So here, at regional level, in terms of the things that you resumed yourself in your introductory remarks, whether it is the Kampala Convention, whether it is the plan of action that came out of the year of refugees, returnees, and internally displaced persons, whether it is Agenda 2063, whether all those, we see in here a region that has truly nailed the internal displacement issue to its regional flag, including specifically solutions. And this is demonstrated as well at national level. Somalia has been mentioned already, but there are other countries as well which are continuing in this thrust. So these positive and demonstrable examples of owning the issue, the panel, I think, will speak strongly of what the Africa region represents. But let us turn then to the other part where the panel also is right now trying to draw out how can these frameworks, how can these positive elements be made actually to work? And now I turn to the three questions with which I'll finish. First, actually the issue in this context in which the glass is half full is really not that owned. Typically, the issue is seen not only as a humanitarian issue, but a humanitarian issue for which actors such as IOM, such as UNHCR, such as others are responsible. And these may and do bring an important effect in keeping people alive, but that is not the way that solutions is going to be made to work. So this part of bridging political will, political action, political ownership is an important part of the panel's work, not only for Africa, but more generally speaking. And if I was to try and market a potential conclusion from our work here, it would be that especially for the Africa region, when the forum next meets in a year from now, that it could be oriented much more to auditing implementation of all these frameworks that we have had described here, and to highlight what is it that is working and what is not working that needs to be brought much more. This is the second issue. The third issue, which it will be very easy for me to talk about because Filippo Grandi already talked about it, is that the nexus is a critical part of what has to happen. But nexus not so much in terms of just language, but in terms of things that actually must be done. How is the internal displacement issue being framed as a national developmental, a national peace, as we heard from the minister from South Sudan, as a national disaster preparedness and response issue? How exactly is that done? And if we come to looking at the question that way, we see excellent examples, such as in Somalia. I go back to that example because it's been a very well developed one. But we also see others where actually there is not one single entity that is seized with and looking at the internal displacement issue end to end, never mind solutions. Never mind solution when that is to tackle questions such as access to public services, such as actually creating a secure environment for people to be able to realize their full potential across the issues, such as, again, the High Commissioner for Refugees talked about in reference to the Sahel. When we look at it in these granular times, the continent is characterized by important examples, but quite frankly, much fewer than those where we can see a complete normative policy and operational architecture to make these things happen. So in that way, the panel, hopefully by the time it finishes its work and drawing on a lot of the things he has had, including from the Africa group, will have some recommendations. But again, I say that for this region, a lot of those things have been established by the region itself. Then we turn to finally an international community that is fit for purpose. Here, the panel already can recognize and applaud very much the incredible work that is being done by the international community, by regional players, by organizations such as are represented in this conversation. But there are a number of gaps. I just simply add my voice to what has been said about synergies which need to be created much more. Quite frankly, what the panel was saying already in the early days of its work, even today, with all the mechanisms, with all the arrangements that have been in place, the internal displacement issue is still an orphan issue. It is still an orphan issue in an integrated way within the United Nations system and in different ways, including, for instance, in the other important issue that the panel is going to talk about, financing arrangements. The rhetoric is strong, is good to provide financial support to integrate the internal displacement issue as a development issue, but it's being backed up with, in practical terms, is still to be seen. So I conclude and I finish in recognizing the importance of this region for the work of the panel, the contacts and engagements that we have already. We have received submissions from the panel. We are ready to continue receiving more because we received about only 8 from the region. So the season is still open. And the panel now is having a series of dedicated dialogues with the leaderships in the capital. So we will welcome to have more with the countries of this region. I thank you very much, and I hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, George, for really those insights. And again, thank you very much for the good work that the panel is doing. They've had several discussions with the MDBs, and really the work that is coming out is very encouraging. And as you have rightly elaborated, in the interest of time, I may not have to go through everything. Now, we really have to do some time management here because I have one general question that I want all the panelists to respond to, but at the same time, I would want to really have 1 or 2 questions from the participants also. Maybe there's a burning, issue there that they want to raise for the, panel. So the question is, what are your recommendations to better operationalize the humanitarian development peace nexus and more effectively integrate forcibly displaced populations in national development planning and peace processes? It's just, take 1 minute or 2, each one of you, just to give us 1 or 2 recommendations that we can call. So I'll just call out your name. So High Commissioner Grande, you go first.
Thank you very much. I would say there are some important premises to look at. First of all, nothing will work if there are not more serious efforts to make peace. Sorry to sound very obvious here, but when we have a Security Council that cannot even agree on the most basic humanitarian resolutions, we're in trouble, even in terms of inclusion and solutions. Now, we know that. I've got it off my chest and I can proceed. The second point I wanted to say is that, of course, it is important also to be more systematic in looking at root causes, including, by the way, we haven't really mentioned much of that. It was mentioned, but not much. The impact of the climate emergency on population movements and its intersection with conflict, poverty, and other factors. And then inclusive approaches. I think everybody has mentioned that. Let me just flag it because it is very important. I think that I would very much second what George just said. He spoke about internal displacement, but it applies to displacement, I think, at large. A more vigorous, deliberate focus on solutions when they're possible. And I want to just conclude my quick intervention. George mentioned 4 concepts. I'll mention 5 words, not 4, 5 words. One is solutions have to be comprehensive when it comes to displacement. Refugees and IDPs often flee from the same context. And this is what we're working on. I was very happy to hear the Minister of South Sudan, Minister Majongde, speak about that, because with South Sudan and Sudan, we are really looking at solutions for both countries. We're talking about 7 million people between the two countries, hosted by them or in exile just in neighboring countries. So comprehensive solution, regional solution. This is a corollary of the initial one. And I think the Sudan, South Sudan example is very important from that respect. We need to be courageous. We need to work also with the regional organizations in Africa and elsewhere, not just the AU, but also the sub-regional organization that can contribute like IGAD does in East Africa in this respect. Solutions have to be adapted. You know, much has been said about internal displacement. We observe, and many of us observe, that internal displacement often becomes another word for urbanization. Granted, people flee because of conflict, drought, other factors. They end up from rural areas in cities. So the solution there is not clearly return to the rural areas, is urban development and urban planning. So that's the adaptation that is my third word. The fourth is, of course, well-resourced. I've spoken about that in my first intervention, the role of the IFIs, the role of the bilaterals, the role that we haven't mentioned much of the private sector and the creation of investment, very important as we talk about addressing or the issue of solutions for forced displacement. And of course, last but certainly not least, solutions, interventions in support of displaced population have to be strategic. And when I say strategic, I mean many things, but one comes to mind. And again, let me go back to South Sudan and Sudan, since they came up in this conversation a lot, and the minister is here. In both peace agreements recently concluded in the two countries, the issues of resolving forced displacement is one of the chapters of the peace agreement. This is very, very important because this links how you address forced displacement with the political process and somehow guarantees the sustainability of the solutions that will be found. Thank you, Mr. Mal.
Thank you, Commissioner. Director Jeff.
Thank you very much. And I liked the identification of adaptation as one of the priorities. And we know, as I was formerly in East Africa's regional director, we know that the changing weather patterns means that there are El Niños and La Niñas, and there's the Indian Ocean dipole, and that brings a whole bunch of complications. And a lot of displacement, when it happens, it's hard to get people back home. So adaptation is a big one, but also we need to prepare better because we know it's coming. There's some good methodologies. IGAD was one of the first at it to identify when these crises are coming. And so there needs to be invigorated. I would say that solutions are homegrown. They're not exported in from outside. There's a lot of experience. There's a lot of human capital, and we need to build upon that in Africa. There's, of course, the AU, and you've referred to a lot of mechanisms there, and the RECs, I think Filippo referred to them. And so we need to incorporate them, but there's got to be resourcing and allocation. But the main message I would have is look at coordination frameworks, is that there needs to be ownership at the government level, and there needs to be cooperation with the humanitarians and the development actors and the UN country team. And so there should be a joint approach between the HCRC and the government, and they should be looking at solutions in a dedicated way or fashion always. We need to have those groups active because we all suffer from global warming. We're all suffering from migratory flows, and then complex issues of displacement come into that. And the other most important thing, which I was trying to emphasize in my previous interaction, is we have to include local actors and local governments, and there needs to be a localization, that whole agenda. We have accountability to affected populations, we have accountability to communities, we need to jointly look at development, and coming together as a system where we know who's accountable and when is going to help us get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Honorable Minister Majongde.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, so it's just your, your final take. 1 minute in terms of what recommendations can you give?
Actually, the most important things, I surely agree, the issue of internal displaced persons, including also the issue of refugees. Also, as I said earlier, it's very important that we have to have a permanent solutions and durable solution. If not permanent, then we must have a durable solutions. And one of those durable solutions is basically for us to be able to address issues beyond migrations, beyond internal displaced persons, so that we could be able to have people settled. And questions of course, I just had the other colleague in the panel just talked about the internal displaced persons. Actually, it makes the habbans, many people move to the habbans, but even if they are in the habbans, they find economic crisis, they find difficulties, and this is absolutely a key issue here. However, including the refugees, when they also return back home, some have been away for a number of years, for a number of times, so we have an issue that needs to be addressed. Far more important is that political solutions, and that comes in the empowerment of the local governments to be able to deal with the most vulnerable people at the grassroots, where we could not be able to treat them when crises arise. So therefore, the empowerment of the local government to have the ability, not only just for law enforcement, but also to be able to have healthcare, to be able to have schools, to be able to have other facilities that probably makes people move. At the end of the day, I personally do believe that anybody can live anywhere, so this is basically my take on that. However, with the implementations in the South Sudan context, that the peace agreements implementation need to be enforced, that will favor all the parties to these agreements. And also we are aware of the other issues that comes in as a result of displacement that is caused by internal conflict, for political reasons, for economic reasons, for social differences. So we're all aware about that, but we have to find a durable solutions. So my 1 minute is finished, moderator.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. So we move to Director Stan.
Thank you very much, moderator. Good job. And well, I'd like to emphasize, probably, I agree with all the other recommendations. I think I'd like to emphasize prevention. We do recognize that forced displacement is a symptom of an underlying cause. And I think I believe that if we can sort of reconceptualize prevention in a way that brings together the humanitarian, the development, the security, the peace building, that can actually be a unifying factor to ensure that a focus on prevention starts to get us closer to solutions. And the best form of prevention, of course, has to happen internally within communities where infrastructures, local infrastructures for peace can actually be built. That is the only way we can have it in a sustainable way. It's been proven already, for whoever doubted, including the UN World Bank study in 2018 on pathways to peace, looking at prevention. Just how effective good prevention and successful prevention efforts can be. And so, that will greatly help. Finally, just to say, to avoid labeling entire countries or entire regions in a way that determines the kind of expertise we think they need, because in every particular country, we have specificities of region and of areas where you can do development, areas where it's conflict prevention and all that. And so it's important that we adapt, partners, especially external partners, adapt their support to the true needs of countries and not sort of apply templates when we partner with a particular country. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Director Stan. George?
Thank you so much, Yero. I can say only very briefly that everything that we had in the initial discussions and in the thumbnails of recommendations right now is on the table of the panel. So it is rather myself who is very delighted that from this conversation, the panel is in the right direction. If I had any 3 cents to add as a citizen of the world, it would be align myself very much with the notion that the perception of these as internal displaced persons should be very strongly replaced by the reflex of them as citizens of a country who are in peril. And not only does that not diminish the responsibility of the government, as the humanitarian perspective tends to do, it rather multiplies the national imperative to act. But I just want to thank very much this opportunity that we have had to hear, and for all the points that have been made, which correspond exactly with what the panel is doing right now. Thank you very much.
No, thank you all very much for really this succinct and really deep reflections. Now I'll open the question to the floor, and there's already one question for High Commissioner Grandi. The question reads, to what extent were the pledges made at the Global Refugee Forum put into practice and have contributed to resolving forced displacement, fostering inclusion, and strengthening the resilience of forcibly displaced populations, as well as their host states against conflict and SOPs, most notably, and also in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa? To what extent were they responsive to the needs at the local and national levels? So over to you, High Commissioner Grandi.
Thank you. In brief, I would say, statistically speaking, there were about 1,400 pledges made at the Global Refugee Forum, of which I would say about a third has been implemented or is being implemented, or rather, I should say more are being implemented, but is almost concluded. So which is not bad, considering that the pandemic, of course, slowed down all these exercises. There are areas in which we have seen quite a lot of progress and fulfillment of pledges. Many, for example, commitments to establish relevant laws or modifying relevant laws about asylum, about different aspects of displacement. I have already spoken about the progress made on the Nexus front, on the pledges made by development organizations and by other states. So all in all, my evaluation of the progress made in the year and something passed since the forum, December 2019, is positive. I wish we could have gone a bit further, but the pandemic also prevented that. We're having a meeting it's called high level meeting in December, 2 years after the forum, 2 years before the next forum, like a midpoint review, which we will use to take stock of what's been done and refresh, if you wish, all the commitments. I think this will also have to be done in the light of the pandemic and what we learned in terms of response, but also in terms of prevention and inclusion. Final point. I think that as we got deeper into the response to COVID-19, we realized how immensely valuable the work done not only at the forum, but also in preparing the Global Compact on Refugees, and George will remember this closely because he was with us at that time. We did that together. Because for example, the notion of inclusion in vaccination programs, in economic rescue packages, if I speak about that now, it's not always done, but it's an acquired concept, it's accepted. And this is thanks to the work of the last few years to arrive to the compact and the forum. So I think it needs to be looked at a process that is fairly long and complex, almost cultural in terms of how we think differently about these things. But I remain optimistic that it will progress further, especially when we get out of the pandemic. And I certainly remain absolutely positive about the value of what we have done in the past few years.
Thank you very much. I think this has been an excellent session from my own personal perspective. There have been many concrete examples given. The reflections have been deep. And I don't think I will do justice if I really try to summarize all these, reflections. But let me just, reiterate what has been said. First is that in addressing this, there has to be a systematic look at the root causes. And that in doing that, we'll put emphasis on prevention and putting that prevention dimension at the forefront of it. Then the other one is the emphasis on inclusive approaches. And third one, which obviously we got a lot of time to dwell into this, is the deliberate focus on solutions, and for solutions that are durable, solutions that are regional, and again, the South Sudan example was a very good one. Then, of course, issue of political will. The political will, which also results to ownership of it. This is a process. It has to be in our national plans. It should be something that really the political leaders feel, as something that is essential, and that left unattended could really cause more problems. So that political will, that political ownership is critical, but also working together. We don't only limit ourselves to working with the AU, but the regional economic communities. And also we have to make sure we work with the partners across the Nexus. And that means having the whole agenda needs to be well resourced. What is the role of the IFIs in this? What is the role of the bilaterals in doing this? And of course, the joint approach, including the local actors on the ground. And I think the examples of really at the Horn of Africa, where we have local communities as part of the solutions, becomes very, very important, starting from the bottom up, looking at the communities, bring the communities at the center of it. Then, of course, the perception of IDPs, looking at it as citizens of the country, which obviously, will try to, draw the national imperative for us, all of us, to act quickly and in a very durable way. And recognizing that this is a long-term process, we all started thinking differently, and from the global compact going for as it unrolls, as we implement it, we are seeing some progress happening and more is expected to happen. I guess this just captures, in my own view, what I'm not attempting to summarize what was said, but hopefully at the end of the day, the ASFAN Secretariat will share with us notes. But I think this has been an excellent session. So thank you all so much, and God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.